Thank you for coming to this panel during and after lunch. We are really grateful for your attention. My name is Julie Papanek. I'm a venture capitalist at Canaan Partners. At Canaan, we invest both in healthcare companies, such as biopharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, and digital health companies, as well as tech companies. So it's really a pleasure to be here with these experts to talk about the intersection of hardware, software, and clinical trials, and how clinical-grade sensors and softwares are going to make a difference in clinical trials today. So I'd like to invite each of my guests to please introduce themselves and a little bit about the role that they play in this ecosystem. Would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Albert Chan. I'm a practicing primary care physician at Sutter Health and VP of our digital health strategy infrastructure, and love supporting the interface between doctors and patients.
Thank you.
I'm Drew Schiller. I'm co-founder and chief technology officer at Validic. Validic is the leading platform for connecting patient-generated data from digital health apps, wearables, and in-home medical devices into the healthcare system. So in the clinical trials space, we work with pharma companies, with CROs, with other vendors to help enable either device agnostic or really device-specific strategies to bring data into the trials from wearable devices, FDA Class 2 devices, blood pressure monitors, glucose meters, et cetera.
I'm Allison Campbell. I'm the global head of patient-centered outcomes research, focused in oncology at Genentech and Roche. And our real focus is measuring what's most relevant to patients by whatever the best methods possible are for not only regulatory approval, but generating evidence for access and reimbursement. So that could go from being a simple questionnaire to a piece of technology, which I think will really complement the future of measuring what's relevant for patients.
And my name is Ferry Tantoro, and I lead the development of digital products at Amgen. And we leverage the different digital technologies and build products that works in conjunction with the innovative medicines that we have. We are also focused on clinical trials and also different products along the patient journey.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you guys. So before we get started, what I'd really love is to understand a little bit better about who's in the audience. And I think it'll help us cater our questions to what might be most useful to all of you. So I know it's lunch, high energy folks, here we go. If you are in a biopharmaceutical company, in the commercial part of that organization, please raise your hand. Hi, we are blinded, so. Yeah. Okay, we got a couple people. Okay. If you're in the development organization, can you please raise your hand? Okay, we got some more people in development, awesome. Who's at a med tech or a hardware company? Okay. Fantastic. Who's in a software company? Software companies. Who's in a service provider? Think CRO, consulting, law firms, all the above. Okay, who am I missing? Feel free to yell out. Who are you? You're a payer. Oh, we love you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We certainly love you. I'll say that.
Are there other payers? We love payers. Okay, so why don't we get started, because we have an incredible panel that comes from provider organizations, software companies that see both sides of this market, and pharmaceutical companies that are consuming these different types of products and sensors and data streams to be useful for your own organizations. So why don't we start with the state of the state? So if I can first start with Allison and Ferry, can you talk a bit about why are you guys doing this? You know, what's the value of working with a sensor or a clinical grade device?
Yeah, sure, definitely I can start. So from our perspective, from Amgen's perspective, we definitely see that there's a trend going on the consumer side of things where there's a lot more consumer wearables and also clinical grade wearables that are coming in the market. And we see the value that those sensors and those wearables could bring by actually making the data collection a lot more passive and actually a lot more data collection as well. So for the study participants themselves in the clinical trial setting, you can think of one of the benefits that they will get is that they could potentially have fewer visits to the clinical trial sites, for example, because the data collection could be done remotely. So that's definitely one benefit that we see.
And you think about those type of benefits, it sounded like it was for clinical trials that are ongoing in the development organization in terms of recruitment and retention and making it easier for patients. Is that right, or does it also include post-marketing trials?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in terms of recruitment, yes, it definitely helps because not only from sort of the cool factor aspects, I guess, of having a wearable as part of the clinical trial, but also reducing the burden. And also sort of the learnings from that in terms of could be the operational aspect, it could be the data aspect, could be a number of things, could also be transferable into the commercial settings for sure.
Okay. Allison, is it similar at Genentech?
Well, I think given my role, I probably have a bit of a different perspective. So when you think about any type of outcomes research, you really want to measure what's most relevant to patients. And so once you identify an outcome of interest in a clinical trial that's most relevant to patients, you then construct an endpoint that a health authority would approve, and then think about what the right tool is to demonstrate the benefit you'd like to discern from that endpoint. And that's kind of the process for clinical outcome assessments right now. I think where technology comes in is there's a lot of concepts that are relevant to patient that are difficult to measure right now. Or, for example, if a patient with brain metastases, we want to understand the impact of a brain metastase, you could rate or administer tests for 2 weeks to a patient and not see the change. But if you could take the NIH toolbox and turn that into something that's more of a game, and these are some of the things we're thinking about with partners in the community, and then you can maybe understand these subtle changes in cognition in 20 minutes versus 2 weeks as part of an endpoint to then understand the impact of a primary brain tumor or brain metastase. That's game-changing in understanding the impact of your benefit for patients. Now, in lung cancer, the best way to understand what's relevant might be to use a 7-item questionnaire to ask patients about their lung cancer symptoms. So I think it depends on the research question, but what I see as an opportunity here is we can't ignore what's happening in consumer health and wearables, and if we can better measure what's relevant to patients with less burden and greater precision and lower cost, then to me that's all upside when thinking about bringing treatments that are valuable to the market.
And so maybe just following up on that, do you see then these type of sensors and wearables and clinical devices being integrated into all trials or a specific set?
So I think one of the challenges is if we just decide we want to take a tool that may or may not meet the FDA hurdle and put it in a trial, and we're not sure what we're measuring and why, that's going to create a lot of noise. And I think that's what's been happening.
Got it.
And I think the way to better think about it, which is a harder way to think about it, is what's the outcome of interest, what's the endpoint, and what's the best tool to measure the outcome of interest. And it could be, if we wanted to measure sleep interference with asthma patients, passive sleep monitoring might be better than a sleep diary. But I really think it comes down to what's the research question you're trying to answer and what's the best tool for the endpoint. And I think what's happening a lot is people are like, this is a really interesting piece of technology, let's put it in the trial, but then it's just noise at the end and we're not able to draw meaningful conclusions. And I think that could really sink this kind of area. I think we have to have a much more rigorous measurement-focused perspective, really understanding what's relevant to patients and kind of doing that outcome endpoint tool walk, even though it's harder. But what I would say on the flip side of that, the risk is you might not be doing the ecosystem sourcing work to figure out those new technologies that are the right tools. So I think there needs to be a balance of creating an endpoint for a trial, but then also experimenting, and maybe in post-marketing is what other companies might be looking at, because we do want to, there's like a push and pull of doing this the right way.
It sounds like some of that push and pull is in the accuracy of the devices and the nature of the questions that can be answered today.
Right.
And drawing a line from that, Albert, I'd love to talk to you because quality and reliability is so important when we talk about clinical care. And how have you thought about what devices to use or how to integrate different sensors into clinical workflow and into clinical decision-making about how patients should be treated?
So for us at Sutter Health, it's really about scale. So we have 5,000 doctors, 51,000 employees, 3 million patients across 100 communities. And so we're looking for workflows that are scalable. And it's clear to me when I look around, I mean, how many of you have bought a device or a toy and put it in the drawer a few months later? That's to me, a show of hands. I mean, yeah, right? To me, that means that we've forgotten about the clinical workflow. And here's the other absurd thing that we do to our patients each and every day. We judge what we should do clinically, like prescribe a med, upon the less than 1% of the time that they spend with us in the clinic instead of the 99+% of their lives outside of the clinic. And so we're looking for solutions that really help inform us, give us new insights that we didn't otherwise have.
And so how has the experience been integrating these products into clinical workflow? Are there any lessons learned as this segment matures and tries to reach scale?
So my first comment to any innovator is, please don't tell me the following statement. They'll say to me, well, if you could just get the doctor to change his workflow, it would work. And I said, you gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. So that's the first lesson learned. I would say having great partners like Validic, having the ability to scale so that we don't have to mess with sort of the interfacing and other things we used to have to do. These one-off approaches just don't work for us at scale. We can't maintain that. It's not sustainable. So we've learned a lot about that. And then really partnership with the docs and the clinics, understanding their workflow, having the discipline to say, geez, what are you trying to solve, so that we don't create more noise, as Allison said, more noise for them. Because if we just turn on a data pipe without any additional insight engines, that's what you'll get, more noise. And as I talked to one innovator, I asked him, do you enjoy your experience at Sutter Health? He said, yes. I said, do we respond to your emails very quickly? He said, yes, like less than 4 hours. I said, yeah, okay, then you can kiss that goodbye. Because if you turn on these data feeds without any insight support, good luck, right? Just good luck.
Got it. I think that's interesting. So let's talk about both sides of the market. So at Validic, Drew, you see the devices that are trying to sell into these organizations and also the demand from large provider systems, pharma, potentially payers from our friend in the back. And I'd love to hear about the trends that you're seeing. Just what are observations you can share for us?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I certainly do have a broad perspective. And from the device side, what I will say is, fundamentally speaking, I'll speak first on the consumer side. These companies are very, very good at something that we in healthcare and in pharma have typically been very poor at, which is engaging consumers and actually designing for the individual. And so I think that there's a lot of work being done. While there's not necessarily clinical accuracy in some of the products that are out there, there's a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of points of leverage with engagement that we can utilize in the healthcare system. So, you know, Albert's system actually brings in some data from consumer wearables, and even though it's not clinically accurate, it's clinically informative to the care that they provide. And there is actually a real interest from these wearable companies, from the consumer companies, in working with folks in the clinical trial space and in healthcare in general. I'm on the board of the Consumer Technology Association for the Health and Fitness Technology Division. And we recently had a medical advisory summit in April. And in September, we're actually hosting our second medical summit at FDA headquarters. So this is all of the consumer wearable companies in the FDA headquarters talking about what they can do to further inform clinical trials and how they can stay on, you know, what they consider to be the right side of regulation, while still being able to provide a lot of value. So there is a lot of interest there. On the other side, on the healthcare side, and specifically on the pharma clinical trials, you know, it's very, very fascinating because what I hear from pharma companies very frequently is, and from CROs, et cetera, is we need clinically accurate data, which I think is very often true, especially, of course, if you're talking about something that is regulated by the FDA. Blood pressure, blood glucose, pulse ox, anything that's a real medical value. Actigraphy is not something that is regulated by the FDA. It's not something that they consider to be necessary to be regulated. They have a pathway for certain regulated devices like the Actigraph and the ActiWatch. However, there are a lot of things on the consumer side that I think are still relevant to the workflow. And so I was recently, I'm on a working group. It's a consumer trials, the Clinical Trials Transformation Institute has a working group to provide guidance to the FDA on how they can think about mobile devices in trials. And I was recently in a meeting, and what was happening was the FDA was saying, you can use consumer devices in these trials. We just need to understand that the device is fit for purpose for the investigator, that the investigator has said, here is the device, here is what it's delivering, and for the purposes of what I'm measuring, this is good enough. I don't need to have an actigraph. I don't need to have an FDA device. And the pharmaceutical companies were saying, no, but we really want you to provide additional regulation into this market. And I think that there's you were talking about like a push-pull. I think there's a real concern there because if the FDA decides to all of a sudden start to regulate all of these consumer health companies, I think that we really start to hinder innovation. And I think rather we should all be able to capitalize on the innovation and leverage the innovation that's going on in the space. So the FDA is actually incredibly open and willing to partner with the consumer technology companies as well as with the healthcare companies to help find a happy medium.
So maybe we can talk to across the board. How do you guys think about that clinical grade versus consumer grade device? Like, is there more of a demand? Is that reflective of what we heard from Drew? You mainly interested in clinical grade, 510K approved, class 2 plus devices, or is there a role for consumer devices as well in clinical care and in studies?
I mean, I think we want rigorous and reliable ways to measure what's meaningful to patients. And if it doesn't need to be FDA grade to be rigorous and reliable to enable informed clinical decision making, then I think that's acceptable. I think some of the concern is the type of validation that might go into something that a tech community, I joke about like my dinner app, if I don't get the right dinner, you can send me the right dinner afterwards. But this is healthcare, so we can't validate on the fly. And so I think if from a tech perspective, you understand that what we're looking for is rigor and reliability and validity, and you can deliver that in something without it being regulated by the FDA, I think people would be comfortable with that. But I think it really just comes down to rigor.
Okay.
Yeah, and I completely agree with the validation piece of things because it still needs to be validated, but it is validated for the fit for purpose that Drew mentioned earlier, right? So, needing something to be validated does not mean that it has to be accurate to the to take your example, an activity doesn't need to be accurate to the minute level of the steps, for example, right? It could be, for example, looking at the trend, looking at an aggregate level of data that could be used for certain clinical trials, right? As an example, for migraine, for example, right? You could potentially use that to look at, how the person's activity changes, over days to see if they were maybe having a migraine attack or not. So that's just an example. And on the other side of things, with the consumer side of, even the apps and things like that, like Drew mentioned earlier, that it is definitely providing a lot of engagement, right, for the study participants, and that is actually also a critical piece for any clinical trial, right? We want to keep them engaged. We want to make sure that, they're also staying adherent as well to the protocols that we're applying in the clinical trial. One of the panelists mentioned earlier today that adherence is a problem, right, in the consumer world, and it is the same for clinical trials. It's really no different, right? So having engaging devices that can help with adherence in a clinical trial also helps.
That's fascinating. Is it similar for you?
Certainly, translation from the bedside to the home. We need to figure out workflows that solve the last mile and scale. So we have, classically trained in medicine, we talked about clinical trials and them being the holy grail, right? But then when you actually get into practice, what actually happens? So we need to balance these things. I'm not saying we don't want rigor and validation, because we absolutely need that, because we're making clinical decisions based on that data. But that's not to say we shouldn't also have the discipline to say, well, how do you actually make it work in the real world? And those consumer-grade devices have done that.
Yeah, and also, so to Ferry's point, also to Albert's point, when you have a wearable device, and whether or not this Fitbit is the right one or not, when you have a wearable device and you can just put it on and you can just leave it on, all of a sudden now I'm an active participant in a clinical trial without doing anything else, right? I mean, maybe I get a text message and I fill out an ePro later in the day, but fundamentally speaking, I'm collecting data for the trial right now, or I'm collecting data to monitor my chronic disease right now. And that's really valuable data that we've never had. We've never been able to connect those dots before.
But I also think it's important to consider that the level of rigor that you might need for routine health monitoring versus what the FDA would require for a label claim is different, and to remember that, because I do think if we're looking at characterizing patient benefit in a way that can be used for publication, for access, for guidelines, that might not have to adhere to the FDA hurdle if we want to get something in the label and be communicated to patients. And so I think for folks more on the tech side, that's something to be mindful of, is that there's different, I kind of view it as a pyramid of evidence, and there's different levels of rigor depending on how high you go up. So be mindful of kind of what your audience is, because I liked your point about that.
So do you think that the the patient-reported outcomes, which are always seen kind of through rose-colored glasses, which are able to be put on a label, right? So do you think that data is more valid than data that is actually collected, and whether or not it's gone through rigor? I mean, it's actually there, right? It's not.
I'd say, well, is it
it's rose-colored data, but I mean, is it?
Well, I think 2 points is, one is there's very little patient-reported data in labels right now.
Yes.
Very little that meets the hurdle of the guidance. What I would say is I think a patient report, one of the jokes one of my colleagues has, and I wish I had a hammer when he gets that question, is, he'll kind of hit you in the knee with a hammer and just say, why don't I tell you what your knee pain feels like? Because that assumption that a patient can't reliably report what their pain feels like isn't helpful. I think it's complementary. So what I would say is there's a lot of discussion about, well, this objective measure on my wrist is better than asking a patient. Well, what if we find out that the underlying software was flawed, or there was, we don't understand how to interpret that to determine clinical meaningfulness? I think there's work to be done. What I would say is some concepts might be best measured by this, and some concepts like pain might be best measured by asking a patient, but really it comes down to what's relevant to patients and then what's the best way to measure it. So instead of kind of seeing it in competition, I would say it's complementary. But I do think the FDA will apply the same criteria that they do to clinical outcome assessments to wearables. So I think that's a nice allegory if folks are looking for one about how to get it approved.
So as a follow-up to that, who is responsible for getting these wearables and the data streams to turn into a PRO, or patient-reported outcome, for those of you who do not live in the endpoint jargon land that we all live in? How do we get out of not really an endpoint in a non-critical trial to, I think about your example with migraine. I'm not saying this is the drug, but let's just say it's an anti-CGRP antibody that is important. And you think about these drugs that really matter, or these patients that really matter where you're focusing on. Is it your responsibility as pharma to get those devices to become a validated, reportable, informed measure for an endpoint? Or is that the startup's responsibility? Or is it Validics' responsibility? Like, who's going to do that?
I would say it's both. I mean, I think sponsors are the folks that have the expertise, that understand, a briefing package, a type B, a type C meeting versus a drug development tool, and how to shepherd it. And at the end of the day, we're bringing evidence to the FDA for them to respond to. So we'll have the cases, but I think it's in partnership with the technology community to bring things forward and want to actively work with us to bring those test cases to the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's partnership at the end, right? So, we're not the expert on the technology side of things, right? So we have to rely on the technology companies, obviously, to be able to, provide us those insights and those data that would be necessary as part of the validation. Whether we like it or not, there's currently maybe a precedence of using a patient-reported outcomes, right? That we have to somehow reconcile, I guess, in a way that, hey, between the patient-reported outcome and, the more passive data collection, is there a correlation, or maybe those are two completely separate things, or maybe those are things that are completely complementary to be working together.
Mm-hmm. And are you interacting with the FDA related to these patient-reported outcomes?
Me personally, no.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that this brings up a broader theme of, I personally like to work with vendors who are willing to get their hands dirty. You know, I made mention of sort of solving the last mile problem, and I really don't have any tolerance for vendors to say, well, that's too hard, that'll interfere with my timeline. I say, well, then why should we work with you? Because I have the trouble of actually having to deal with patients every day.
Right.
So guess what I'm going to be focused on? Someone who wants to make it work.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So let's keep going on that theme. What are recommendations and tips that you would give to, you know, you think about the people who are in this room. You have your peers from other systems and pharma companies, but also device companies and service providers. You know, it could be a CRO. Just pick your favorite, top of mind, something you wish you could fix. Anything.
I mean, I would just say to remember that if you're creating a device, hardware, or software for a patient for use in clinical trials, that you're going to be operating under a lot of regulation. You know, when I was first in pharma, someone explained to me how pharmaceuticals have more regulations than nuclear power. So that's a key piece to remember. And to me, the people I think that are going to really be the folks that change this field on the precipice of change are those that are willing to really embrace what the biotech healthcare perspective needs with rigor and technology. And those are going to be the companies that succeed and really define what the future of measuring what's relevant to patients are.
Yeah, there's definitely the aspect of, you know, the regulation aspects really critical, like you said. And, you know, it's a good thing, though, that I think we're starting to see that more and more companies actually, when they come to talk to us, they are actually, you know, having the same jargon and having the same understanding actually in that space, you know, that they've been talking to the FDA, that they've been looking at the different regulations that are needed. You know, one other aspect that I would also say is that I think it's important to start small, you know, especially in this space, right? Because it's such a new space, right? You know, so it's much easier for all of the companies, you know, when we work together, is to just set a predefined, you know, small goal at the beginning with the intent of obviously to scale that, you know, down the road. But start small so that, you know, we can address some of the challenges first and be able to get a product out the door, you know, and with whether it be in clinical trial or commercial the same way.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
So I would say too, there's two other, you have two customers, right? You have the endpoint patient who's going to ultimately use this, and you have the provider system who's going to implement it. So I would include them up front. So one of the things we're doing at Sutter Health is including patient advisors robustly in our decision-making process because, gosh darn it, they are actually the customer. So maybe we ought to listen to them. Similarly, the provider system as well, and work together. So start small, prove some of these cases, take on the challenge of figuring it out, because it's going to serve you downstream, but figure it out, and then allow you to scale, I think.
Yeah, and you have to embrace that we really don't know how to your point, Allison, how to run clinical trials that leverage devices very well. Yeah. And so there are probably going to be some false starts. I know there have been many false starts, and you know, I was speaking with somebody a few weeks ago. And I was just telling, you know, I was giving an idea out there about how we could potentially build a remote monitoring solution or an enhancement to a pharmaceutical to help add some behavior change around the drug in addition to everything else, just ideating. And she said to me, well, yeah, but haven't we tried that before and it failed? And I said, yeah, but we also know that behavior change paired with a drug is always going to be better than the drug alone, right? So, I mean, that one time that we tried something and it didn't work does not mean that the idea is bad. Maybe we can learn from the fact that it didn't, you know. Dr. Eric Topol, who's very, very well known in the digital health space, ran the first randomized clinical trial for leveraging device connectivity. He gave blood pressure monitors, weight scales, and ECGs, and measured patients with hypertension, arrhythmia, diabetes. And over a 6-month period, this was at Scripps down in San Diego, measured patients over a 6-month period. And at the end, after all the results were analyzed and everything else, they found nothing. They found there was no benefit. Now, is there a benefit to measuring patients with these devices who have diseases like hypertension?
So with all due respect to Dr. Tropel, we've actually had some positive results so far.
Right.
For sure, in hypertension and diabetes.
Yeah, and so there is an opportunity. I think that probably 6 months might have been too short of a time period. I think that he wasn't leveraging the patient's phones, the patient's actual handheld devices. He gave them a separate iPhone that they had to carry around. Like, there were a lot of things. But you know what? That gives us a baseline to build another study and learn from, and actually design a study that can actually maybe prove some of these endpoints, like what Dr. Chan and his team are doing.
And if I can add to that, I think my perspective as an investor in this space, another area we've seen value come out is in the speed of iteration for developing other products and services. So examples being you're considering, God forbid, changing workflow. You know, how do you measure impact on patients in some way? And how do you, for a commercial program where you're trying to find a new way to engage with consumers, measure an impact? And it takes so long to measure some of these clinical outcomes. And as you were talking about cancer, you know, survival, like, wow, that is far.
Yeah.
So how do we improve our business today? And I think that there's an incredible way, if we expand the definition of trial to an A/B test beyond a clinical trial or a post-marketing commitment, to be able to actually study what's happening to our customers, as you were saying.
We actually, one of our innovation pathways now is we're trying to do new, I'm going to use trial carefully, but new approaches where we say less than 100 patients, lower the risk, let's see what happens, and try to learn very, very quickly. Because that's how you can get the proof points, right, to really figure this out.
That's great. So I'd love to open it up for questions and make sure that we have enough time from the floor. So if someone could dim the lights a little bit, just so I can actually see the people who are out there, that would be awesome. Does anyone have any questions? There are 2 mics up front. No questions. We have a question. If you could, that would be great.
How's it going? My name is Dan. I'm on the healthcare team at Lyft, and we're obviously thinking about a lot of things around transportation side of it. On the clinical trial side, what do you guys think about the basic starting point of just getting the person to the trial and medical, you know, taking their meds, making sure that they're there for that appointment? How does that process work, and how do you think through that?
I'm so happy you're here.
He got here on
Thank you.
He got here on
Thank you.
time, obviously,
This
too.
is great. So go for it, guys.
Well, full disclosure, we are looking at some opportunities with Lyft. I don't know if you know that, so yeah. So I'll leave it. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'll tell you a personal story. My sister has some mental health issues, and she has 2 children, and she's a single parent. And she was actually in a program where a trial where she was receiving a medication, and it was really helping her. And there were follow-ups, and she had to keep going, and she actually ended up having to drop out of the study because childcare and transportation were a huge blocker for her actually just to show up. So yeah, thank you. I mean, this is solving a real problem. It's meeting a need.
So are you currently using taxicab and delivery providers, or how are you getting your population to those clinical trial points today?
I mean, what I would say is that's kind of owned by the whole operational implementation arm. I'm more on the strategy side. What I would say is anything that's going to facilitate patients getting to the clinic, especially patients with cancer, to make appointments and stay on treatment, is of course going to be embraced as we try to get as many patients as possible into research to bring new medicines forward. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's, you know, the way I see it is that's sort of another way of solving the problem that we were talking about, of making sure that, you know, we can get enough participants in the clinical trials and also engagement, right? Because, you know, we were talking about using, you know, passive data collection, apps and things like that. That's really the problem that we're trying to solve, is that we want to maintain the engagement and we want to get, you know, enough recruitments, I guess, by reducing the burden of the study participants. This is, I think, another good example potentially of, you know, reducing that burden so that the participants don't really have to think about the transportation aspects of going to the clinical trial site.
Question from a gentleman.
Yeah, I wonder, how do you separate the concept of an outcome from an experience? So do you think about the patient experience as in a trial as separate from the actual outcome itself?
Well, as a measurement person, I would say the outcome of interest is something I'm constructing an endpoint to measure as a primary or secondary endpoint in the trial. I also think the patient experience, I should break it down a little bit. Are you referring to the patient experience of the trial or the patient experience of the treatment?
How they're feeling about the treatment.
Okay, yeah, so the patient experience of treatment, which is what we talk about in terms of treatment burden, is actually really important in oncology. And so in breast cancer, for example, where there aren't disease-related symptoms that we can measure, most of the patient-relevant outcomes are related to the patient experience of the treatment or the burden of the treatment. So what I would say is in that situation, the outcome of interest in breast cancer is the treatment experience or the treatment burden, and then we'd create an endpoint and pick the right tool to measure that and try to get that into the label for discussion. Did I address that?
I think so. I think this story sort of gets to that as well. I was speaking with somebody who does some research in muscular dystrophy, and mostly with adolescent males, and he was saying, you know, for these kids, they don't care about a 6-minute walk test. That means nothing to their quality of life, right? What they care about is, can I play with my friends? Or when I am restricted to my wheelchair, can I feed myself? And can I still play video games, right? I mean, just very, very basic things. And so he's trying to think through how he can design some measures that actually gauge that, which is what's important to the patient, not just what's important to the predictable endpoint.
If I'll add my own example. We've invested in a company called Gluco, which has a device, a small dongle that attaches into almost any blood glucose meter that's FDA approved in the United States, and it takes that data and puts it into a platform mainly for provider organizations to manage their diabetics remotely. And we did a trial in Minnesota with teenage girls, and these are some type 2 and mainly type 1 children. And talking about experience, we sometimes talk about improving their experience. What we found in that study was if we force them to take a blood glucose reading, which was measured through this platform, and it would unlock their phones so they could text their friends, compliance was 100%.
Wow.
So we are talking about a really difficult to treat population. And so when we think about incentives, going back to what's in it for people, I mean, we all have our own experiences of how to change behavior. It's just often, a little bit different in healthcare, but it turns out we're still people. So I think that there's a lot to be learned about incentives in healthcare with wearables.
We're making a bet at Sutter Health that you can't separate the two, because the experience of healthcare is part and parcel with the outcome, right? In fact, my little title, it's a little strange, is we have created a new Office of Patient Experience just for that purpose. Because at the floor, when you walk into the door, you assume your doctor's of high quality. If not, you wouldn't step in the door, right? I hope. So it's got to be better, right? You hope. So it's got to be better than that. It's got to be great experience and great outcome.
We have another question here.
Yes, please.
Chris from Conversa Health, a software startup. This is probably for Amgen and Genentech, but could you talk a little bit about the larger shape of the clinical trial, by which I mean, like, how long do they last typically? How often do you check in with the patients in the trial? You get data from devices, but to what degree do you need to actually talk to the patient and get some of the data that was referred to, like subjective pain levels and PRO? How do you, is it maybe rich websites or text messages or an email? I'm curious to hear more about that, please.
Do you want to go first? I can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so like all things in pharma, it's not a satisfying answer when I'll say it depends. I mean, it depends on the disease area. I mean, I'll give you an example from oncology. When we were talking about preparing for this panel, they wanted results and case studies and outcomes. And the reality is, if you were to create a new tool to use for an endpoint in a clinical trial, that'll probably take about a year and a half. The protocol's written a year before the first patient's in. The trial, if we're looking at progression-free survival and not survival, could last 3 or 4 years. That's a quick one. And then we're analyzing the data at the end. So the timelines, I feel like that pharma we're really comfortable with are a lot longer than the timelines we look at in technology. And so just bear that in mind when trying to get to proof of concept. What I would say is oftentimes patients are surveyed based on what we need to know for the endpoint. So if we're looking at an improvement in lung cancer symptoms for label, we might sample patients every week versus every 28 days, which is usually the median cycle time. But it really depends on the research question you're answering, and then the modality would depend on the trial as well. It might be on a handheld device where they get reminders. It might be in the clinic. So it really depends on the study, which I think is actually an opportunity because it means that we can actually test a lot of different things in different ways with devices. Because the disease changes the construct of the trial, it gives us ample opportunity to try different things.
Yeah, it definitely varies, from studies to studies, and even within a given study, there are cases where we could consider having sort of a more manual, more high touch, where they would need to check in a lot more often, and then later during the trial that it would slow down or even be converted to more of a electronic version of of a check-in, I guess. So yeah, I completely agree that it is highly dependent on the trial.
When you say check-in, you mean like a phone call from you or the doctor to the patient, or have them come into the office, or what is a check-in?
It's also various.
It's any of those.
Yes.
I mean, in cancer, it tends to be folks coming into the clinic because they come in more frequently because a lot of drugs are still intravenous. But it could be a reminder phone call from a nurse and other methods. Again, it depends on the research question. I mean, if we were really interested in the side effects of a breast cancer drug and we knew that the side effects were at their worst the first 3 months, we might be interacting with patients a lot during that time and then dropping off to maybe measure the patient experience. So it all kind of depends on the research question.
I'm sorry, I cannot see. Sir, do you have a question?
Dr. Steve Turner, Midwest Technology. Do you know of any cases where large companies data mined for a particular drug to see what their post FDA approval process, how efficacious it was, and found out that it really wasn't efficacious as far as cost-benefit analysis, and then went back to the insurance company and said, we were covering it, but we're not going to cover it anymore? I'm thinking of Provenge by Dendreon, where initially it was covered by a lot of health plans, and then they found out that the survival rate wasn't as great as it was purported to be, and it was a very expensive drug, several $100,000 a year, and they stopped paying for it. So I was wondering if you know of any cases similar to that.
I personally am not aware of a case like that. So
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I mean, most drugs do require post-approval surveillance, and lack of benefit is a reportable adverse event. Everyone who works at a pharma company is trained annually on how to report adverse events, and lack of efficacy is something we'd be expected to report. But I don't, off the top of my head, have an example of that.
Yeah, I would say not from a wearable per se or a sensor that I can think of in particular, but I think to comment on Allison's thoughtful comment, there's definitely examples of products that post-approval have been withdrawn for a range of different reasons, and mainly they are dealing with safety or the primary endpoint that they were originally approved on at a larger data set was not aligned with what was seen in the phase 3 pivotal trial or trials. And so that can be data that's mined at a payer as well as at the government level. But I have not seen something like that with a sensor per se. Any other questions? We have a minute. So, rapid fire question? Oh.
Hi, my name is Kit. My question is a follow-up to your title. Are you aware of any study design or methods that could reduce the cost of running a clinical study so that a small startup can actually enroll more patients and get more meaningful data?
I am not. And by the way, Kit, great to see you. I don't know of one that has actually decreased sample size. I'm trying to think about something that, to do so you have to increase
Effect.
and power, and,
Yeah.
well, power is the sample size. I'm trying to think about
I mean, the
something that
sample
does
size
it.
is determined by the research question you're
Yeah.
trying to answer. And so if you had robustness with a device that would enable, with that tool for the endpoint for the outcome would enable fewer patients.
I meant the cost of running a study. So running the cost of a study, you have to pay CRO. Are there any methods that instead of having, like the lift example was great, right? If UberPool would now get all my patients back to the site, then I pay a lot less.
I mean, I think we can definitely see there's potential benefits there, right? You know, through passive data collection, through, you know, helping with the enrollment, you know, engagement, so that less dropout. There's definitely potential benefits there, but I'm not aware of any particular study that's been published that, you know, has shown this kind of as a benefit, I guess.
Yeah, I do think by and large, though, technology, when applied correctly, has the ability to add an economy of scale that and decrease cost. So I'm thinking about you know, Albert's challenge, where he has 5,000 physicians and 3 million patients. The only way, if as more patients start to enter the market through the ACA, and as more physicians start to retire, and you have fewer patients coming in, the only way that you can continue to scale your business is through technology, right?
We're betting on a patient portal. We have 1.3 million patients on our portal. We're betting on telemedicine because we believe that will reduce the barrier for patients to reach us, for sure. So I think the same strategy would apply here.
Well, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel for coming today. It's really been a pleasure.